Today, we're going to try and crack open a huge metaphysical puzzle, one that sits right at the heart of Christian theology. Our source for this explainer points to a really fascinating and, honestly, pretty unexpected origin for the language used to define one of its most central ideas. And you might be surprised to learn that this story, well, it really gets its start in the world of philosophy, not necessarily where you'd expect. So, we've all heard the definition of the Trinity, right? Three persons in one essence. It's a cornerstone of faith, laid out in the Nicene Creed, but have you ever stopped to ask about the words themselves? Specifically, that phrase, one essence. Where did a super philosophical term like that even come from? Well, the answer, as we're about to see, is a lot twistier than you might think. Okay, so to get this, we have to start with a basic rule from classic logic. Think about a first cause, a prime mover. By its very definition, it's the one, single, underived source of everything else. So logically, anything that's begotten or that comes from that source has to be different from it, right? The painter is not the same thing as the painting. This simple principle is actually the key to this whole debate. So with that rule in mind, where did the early church fathers get the vocabulary they needed to talk about God? Well, this is where the story takes a really interesting turn, and it leads us to a group you might have heard of, called the Gnostics. Turns out they had this whole philosophical toolkit of terms that were just perfect for describing the divine. And this is the word, the big one, homoousios. It's a Greek word that means of the same substance or of one essence. This one little word, it's going to become the absolute center of everything, the linchpin for the entire Nicene Creed. Now here's the kicker, our source points out. The first people we see using this word, it wasn't the church fathers. It was a group of Gnostics called the Valentinians, way back around 150 AD. For them, it was the perfect word to describe their idea of divine beings, or aeons, that all flowed out of a single source. You know, like rays of light from the sun? All the rays are distinct, but they're all made of the exact same divine light stuff. Okay, so if homoousios is the divine stuff, then what do you call the individual rays of light? Well, that's where our second key term from the Gnostic toolkit comes in, hypostasis. It just means an individual, distinct existence. It's how they could talk about lots of different divine beings that were all fundamentally made of the same thing. So when you put it all together, the Gnostic framework, saying there are multiple hypostases in one ousia or essence, made perfect sense for them. You could have many individual gods or divine powers that all shared the same basic nature. It was a philosophical tool built for a pluralistic world. All right, but wait a minute. This brings us to a huge plot twist. If this language was so perfect for the Gnostics, a group the early church considered major heretics, how in the world did it become the bedrock of Christian orthodoxy? Yeah, that's the real puzzle, isn't it? It seems like a total contradiction. Why would the church adopt the language of the very people they were arguing against? It just doesn't make sense until you look at the timeline, which shows a dramatic and incredibly fast reversal. Okay, just look at this journey. It is wild. Around 150 AD, the Gnostics are using homoousios. Then, boom, in 268, a church council at Antioch officially condemns the word. They basically say, nope, that's Gnostic talk, we don't want it. But then, and this is the craziest part, just 57 years later, the Council of Nicaea does a complete 180 and makes that very same forbidden word the absolute heart of their official doctrine. What on earth happened in those 57 years? So who bridged that gap? Our source points to a brilliant but controversial thinker named Origen of Alexandria. He was trying to do something really ambitious, merge Greek philosophy with Christian scriptures. But in trying to hold both of those worlds together, he kind of walked himself into a logical corner. So here's the problem Origen created for himself. On one hand, he'd say, look, the Son has to be eternal, just like the Father, because God can't change, right? God can't just go from not being a father to being a father. Makes sense. But then, in the very next breath, he'd also insist that the Son was lower in rank, that he was subordinate, that he was only God by participation. He tried to have it both ways, and it created a paradox. And this is where our source material just puts its foot down and says, that doesn't work. Logically, it's a dead end. You simply can't say a being has the exact same absolute nature of God, but then turn around and say it lacks the absolute attributes of God, like ultimate authority. It's a fundamental contradiction. But was this Gnostic-inspired philosophical model the only game in town? Was it the only option on the table? According to our source, absolutely not. There was a completely different model available, one that came from a totally different Hebrew way of thinking. This alternative is called the Shaliach principle. It's all about agency. Think of it this way. An ambassador speaks with the full authority of the king. When the ambassador speaks, it's as if the king is speaking. But the ambassador is not the king, right? They are two different people. The authority is transferred, but the essence, the being, is not the same. And there's this beautiful, powerful metaphor for this idea in an early text called The Teachings of Sylvanus. It says, "The Son is the hand of God." It's perfect, isn't it? Your hand carries out your will. It acts with your power. It is of you, but your hand is not you. It's a model of perfect representation without identical essence. All right, so let's put it all together now. We've got these three different ways of looking at this: the agency model, the Gnostic model, and the Nicene model. Let's line them up side by side and see how they stack up based on the source's final analysis. This chart really breaks it down. Look at the essence row. For the agency model, the essence is distinct, but for both the Gnostic and the Nicene models, it's identical. Now, jump down to the logical status row at the bottom. The argument here is that the agency model is consistent, and even the Gnostic model is consistent within its own system. But the Nicene model, by trying to merge these different ideas, it becomes, according to this analysis, self-refuting. And that brings us right to the core thesis of our source material. The Nicene formula ended up as a kind of metaphysical mashup. It took the Gnostic idea of a shared same essence and tried to force it into the very different, strictly monotheistic Hebrew framework of one being. And the result, this analysis claims, is a logical paradox. How can different things share the exact same essence and be truly co-equal, yet still be distinct persons within one being? So we end with a question for you to think about. We've just walked through an argument that a core theological doctrine was constructed using a philosophical toolkit borrowed from a group that was considered heretical. So the final question is this: how does understanding the messy, complicated philosophical journey of an idea change how we view that idea today? That's definitely something to chew on.